Welcome back. Thank you very much for staying with us here on SA Today. Well, African Capacity Building Foundation and African Union entity held its 29th Board of Governors this week. The meeting discussed the impact of COVID-19 on the development and capacity building agencies across the entire continent. The body consists of the African Union member states, finance ministers, World Bank, Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, United Nations Development Fund and African Development Bank senior officials, among others. For more on this, we're joined by the Executive Director of ACBF, Professor Emmanuel Nnadozie, an economist and development expert. A very warm welcome to you, Prof. Thank you for being with us here on SABC News.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
Just as a start, let's talk about the 29th Board of Governors meeting and discussions around the impact of COVID-19, which I suppose form the core of discussions into many of the meetings. But I specifically want to talk about development and capacity building agencies across the African continent. Obviously, some great challenges this year as we've been in the midst of COVID-19, but also opportunities. So if you can talk to both of those for us, please.
Yes, as you rightly pointed out, our Board of Governors meeting, which is held annually, was designed to provide an opportunity for the key stakeholders, who are the African finance ministers or planning ministers, to have a very good view of the state of the foundation and the achievements, but also to help us in setting the policy direction and look into issues, critical issues of capacity development on the continent. And for them, at present, the critical capacity development challenge facing the continent is the capacity to deal with the COVID-19 pandemic and its economic and social consequences. And of course, as you know, the economic consequences come in various ways. Because the pandemic is not just a health issue alone. Of course, we regret the people who have suffered the health challenges, but also those who have lost their lives because of the pandemic. And so there's a human loss. But also in putting in mitigation measures to try to deal with the pandemic, such as lockdowns or travel bans or other restrictions, these had economic consequences affecting livelihoods, affecting jobs, and affecting income, and preventing people from actually being able to function the way they normally would function. So for them, the recognition that we needed to, as ACBF, the African Capacity Building Foundation, that we needed to really pay attention to, assisting our member states in dealing with these problems. And so we informed the finance ministers that the ACBF did develop a COVID-19 response strategy, which calls for continued capacity development efforts in support of the member states.
And how has the response, and Prof, how has that response been to the member states that you've had that sort of communication in terms of talking to those finance ministers? What kind of response are you receiving for the plans that you have?
No, we're receiving very strong response. In fact, the request for our support is quite significant. For example, we know very well that right now, the economic dimensions will require countries to not only figure out how to mobilize resources, but how to deal with the economic growth that has now slowed down or in some cases diminished, but also how to balance the budgets that are now being seen in deficits, because countries will need resources to be able to implement their economic development plans and strategies. But we know also that a lot of countries have now found themselves borrowing quite a bit. So the debt issue becomes a significant problem. Macroeconomic policy making also becomes a challenge. So they are responding very possibly to our strategy to try to assist the countries. First of all, to put in place mechanisms that will help them to be more prepared in the future to deal with such pandemics, as well as being able to deal with the post-COVID-19 debt and macroeconomic challenges that will come, and find ways of ensuring that they are able to continue to implement the sort of policies that will reduce poverty and create jobs for young people and deal with the social consequences of the pandemic.
Yeah. Prof, the African Union expects and also encourages all its member states to take advantage of the agreement and participate in intra-Africa trade. On the other hand, we learned that about 10 countries on the continent are not members of the ACBF yet. Some of them have already established industrial activities that are doing well, most of which are driven by multinational companies. How is that gap going to be bridged, and how are you going to ensure that none of the member states are left behind due to that gap that will ultimately be created anyway?
Well, you know, the African Capacity Building Foundation in 2017 was granted the status of the specialized agency of the African Union for capacity development in the continent by the African heads of states. So, in consequence, every African Union member automatically becomes a member of ACBF. But of course, our definition is those who probably have put in some membership fees for supporting our strategy. But ACBF provides support to all African countries, regardless of whether or not they have signed an agreement or not. So that's number one. Mm-hmm. Number two, the African free trade agreement, the Continental Free Trade Agreement, is a very important game changer for the continent. And this is something, unfortunately, that has been somewhat negatively affected by the pandemic. And so, even though it was supposed to come into effect right now, that has been postponed. But in any case, what ACBF has been doing is to say, how ready are African countries to be able to implement this agreement, but also to be able to benefit from it and maximize the benefit they will get from it in terms of trade and in terms of economic growth and in terms of creating jobs. So we have been putting this readiness assessment that we have been doing on countries to find out to what extent they are ready to do that. And this is something that is quite in high demand right now. Because believe it or not, if you look at the work that we do every year on assessing capacity in African countries, we find that at least about 10 countries only have what we call a high level of capacity development. And then we have about another 31 that has medium capacity development, then 5 countries that are about low capacity. So whether it's in terms of policy environment, in terms of processes of implementation and development results and capacity development outcomes. So these are the sort of things that we are now doing to assist countries to maximize the benefits that they can get from the African Continental Free Trade Agreement so that it be to the benefit of their people.
All right, Prof, it's been a pleasure talking to you. Thank you very much. And we look forward to seeing more of your work in 2021, as obviously much of the work has been impacted or affected by this COVID pandemic. Thank you very much, sir, for giving us your time.
Thank you very much for having me. I wish you all the best, and greetings to your listeners as well.
Thank you, sir.